Welcome back to Intro to American Studies and our last reading of Unit 1 on race and ethnicity. Hopefully, these 3 readings have given you a sense of the many ways that scholars are studying race and ethnicity and their relationship to Americanness more broadly. So this week's reading gets us out of the boxes of whiteness and blackness that we have been in so far to add another layer of racial and ethnic complexity, the role of Latinidad, and particularly Puerto Ricans in the American story. But before we get to that, I just want to comment on your reflections thus far. Most of them have been really great, and I've enjoyed reading them. Some of you are not clearly reflecting on the reading. So if the author's name does not appear in your reflection, that's probably not a great sign. If you're having trouble with this, I suggest starting your reflections this way, with something like Sonia Songha Lee, or whoever the case may be, expanded or challenged my understanding of America by, right? And explain what the author said and explained and how that relates to your own understanding. So this week, we're reading the introduction to Sonia Songha Lee's Building a Latino Civil Rights Movement. And I chose this book because so often when we talk about race, conversations center on a sort of white-black binary, meaning there are just 2 kind of categories, and therefore generally assuming that the victims of racism are only Black Americans, or more recently, the phrase Black and Latinx Americans has become common, or sometimes the broader people of color. But these tendencies flatten out the experiences of so many different groups of people, making it seem like racism and resistance to it is a singular phenomenon, and that Blackness or even Latinidad is a singular phenomenon. And what Lee's book does is focus on a specific community, New York City's Puerto Rican community, to show how Puerto Ricans specifically made pivotal contributions to the civil rights movement in New York City. And furthermore, she shows how Puerto Ricans experienced and imagined their race and ethnicity in different ways depending on the circumstances. So thinking back to the Jacobson reading, and how, for example, Jewish immigrants could be seen as not quite white, but also not Black, and therefore could use their whiteness and their Jewishness strategically to say, at times, we are white, so we deserve XYZ privileges, but also we're not white, so we deserve XYZ accommodations. Right. So Lee is building on this sort of work within whiteness studies to show how Puerto Ricans experienced their own particular version of this sort of racial in-betweenness. And I found most fascinating how she explains the way that the terms race and ethnicity developed in the post-war era. And by post-war, generally historians use that phrase to refer to after World War II. So post-war meaning after World War II, so sort of the 1950s to the end of the 20th century. So remember again that Jacobson showed us how before World War II, the term race was used to describe all these different European immigrant groups as inferior white races. But after World War II, these groups were incorporated into a sort of consolidated American whiteness, and Jews and Italians and others were now considered different ethnicities, not different races. So in this context, Lee shows how Puerto Ricans sometimes claimed that they were ethnically Puerto Rican, just like Jews and Italians before them, and therefore could argue they were on their way towards whiteness, towards being assimilated into this consolidated American whiteness. However, Lee shows how most Americans, non-Puerto Ricans, did not see Puerto Ricans this way and started to lump them together with Black Americans as racially inferior. So in response, many Puerto Ricans decided to band together with Black Americans to fight the racism that they were both facing in somewhat similar and yet distinct ways. And in the process, these sort of categories of Blackness and Puerto Ricanness were blurred. And in fact, plenty of people are Black and Puerto Rican. And Puerto Ricans who had formerly distanced themselves from their African heritage, or even their general Puerto Rican heritage, began to embrace it through this process, right, of building coalitions and solidarity with their Black American comrades. And also, Puerto Ricans educated Black Americans on their experience as colonized subjects, thereby adding an anti-colonial or anti-imperial aspect to their collective organizing. So it's important to understand that Puerto Rico is still a colony of the United States and has been since the late 19th century. And many Puerto Ricans have been fighting for their independence from the United States for that long, right, over a century. And so while the narrative of European immigration has this nice pro-American ring to it because the story goes that people are coming here from other countries for a better life, the narrative of Puerto Rican migration is more complicated because even though the U.S. likes to see itself as the sort of free democracy that's offering people a better life, Puerto Ricans who do live in the United States, in the colony of Puerto Rico, are neither free nor are they equal citizens in our democracy. Right? Puerto Ricans are not represented in Congress. Anyway, the topic of sort of the nature of Puerto Rican colonization is a whole nother story. But because Puerto Rico is not a state, but it is controlled by the United States, people who live there do not have the same kind of rights that people who live in the 50 U.S. states have. So Lee says on page 20, I really love this quote. She says, quote, "Latino ethnicity is considered more threatening than European ethnicity," end quote. Because ultimately, Latino ethnicity is tied to this history of U.S. conquest and imperialism. So this story of people coming here for a better life doesn't work in the case of Puerto Ricans when they're migrating from, right, their colonized island to the mainland to escape in many cases, conditions that the United States is already in control of, right, on the island of Puerto Rico. And it's important to understand that I'm saying that Puerto Ricans are migrants and not immigrants because they are U.S. citizens. So the sorts of regulations that were used to control who can and cannot come into the country don't apply to Puerto Ricans because they're U.S. citizens. So they really exist in this distinct place compared to a lot of other migrant groups. So Puerto Ricans not only allied with Black Americans in the civil rights movement, but foreshadowing the work that we will do in Unit 3, because of their experience as colonized subjects, they added a transnational lens to the movement, meaning that they expanded their analysis beyond the boundaries of the mainland U.S. And in this process, many Black Americans started to see themselves also as colonized subjects, conceptualizing their inner city ghettos, quote unquote, as internal colonies ruled by white people. So the idea of being colonized even within the mainland of the United States became a way of understanding the oppression of Black people. And Lee's work also foreshadows the work that we'll be doing in the next unit, Unit 2, on intersectionality, because she highlights the central role of Puerto Rican women in this work. And I won't go into that in detail now, but just keep in mind as we move into exploring how gender and other axes of discrimination play into these racial and ethnic dynamics that we have been studying thus far, that Lee's highlighting of the role of Puerto Rican women is an example of a sort of intersectional analysis. So, giving you a sense of, again, what I'm asking you to do in your reflections, I do this at the end of every lecture, so here's my sort of reflection. Sonia Songha Lee's work expanded my understanding of Americans by demonstrating how after World War II, the category of race was seen as a permanent deficiency, whereas ethnicity was seen as something extra that could be discarded or minimized. And Puerto Rican New Yorkers used these ideas of race and ethnicity to navigate their unique position as colonized U.S. subjects and to expand the depth and breadth of the entire civil rights movement. She also blurs the boundaries between these broad categories of white or black or Latinx by demonstrating how Puerto Ricans could fit into all of these categories depending on the situation. Sometimes Puerto Ricans responded to how others categorized them, and sometimes Puerto Ricans chose how they wanted to categorize themselves. Prior to reading this, I didn't really realize this fluid nature of race and ethnicity and the ways that these concepts were used both externally to oppress Puerto Ricans and internally to navigate the complexities of Puerto Rican identity. I feel like so often histories of the civil rights movement focus so much on the experience of Black Americans, or in particular African Americans descended from enslaved people, that the role of other communities such as Puerto Ricans is often kind of sidelined. And really, Lee shows how these Puerto Rican activists were really integral to the civil rights movement in New York, and this is also the case in other parts of the country. Also, I didn't realize how Black and Puerto Rican are actually overlapping categories. Again, often they're sort of just used separately, but in fact, many Black Puerto Ricans were inspired by the civil rights movement to embrace both of these aspects of their identity. And again, foreshadowing next unit, that can be understood as an aspect of intersectionality, right? That the experience of being a Black Puerto Rican, right, is distinct than being a Black American, right, descended from people who were brought to the mainland, distinct from being a Black Dominican or a Black Venezuelan, right? That, the relationship between Blackness and these various Latin American or Caribbean ethnicities creates its own particular sort of lived experiences. So again, that's an example of sort of the intersections of, one could say, sort of race and ethnicity, potentially. Lastly, I want to clarify this concept that Lee talks about immigrants being, quote unquote, maladjusted to the United States, because last semester there was some confusion here. So Lee is talking about how this is a racist idea that activists were fighting against in the 1960s. So psychologists use this idea of people being maladjusted to argue that the struggles faced by immigrants and people of color were because something was wrong with them and their culture, and that in order to become good Americans, they therefore had to adjust to dominant society, right? They had to change their culture. So this is similar to the Muhammad reading last week, right, where he shows how scientists blamed Black people for engaging in crime because something was allegedly innately wrong with those people. So Lee shows how activists in the 1960s reappropriated this term to argue that the problem is not with them and their culture, it's with the racism of dominant society. And therefore, it was a good thing to be maladjusted to a racist society, right? So they're trying to flip the meaning of the term on its head. And Martin Luther King Jr. famously made this point when he said in several speeches in the 1960s, so this is Martin Luther King Jr.'s words that I'm just using to illustrate what Lee is talking about. So King said, quote, "There are certain things in our nation and in the world about which I am proud to be maladjusted, and which I hope all men of goodwill will be maladjusted until the good societies realize. I say very honestly that I never intend to become adjusted to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to become adjusted to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few." End quote. Right? So here we see activists taking this racist term, maladjusted, that psychologists are using to blame immigrants and people of color for their struggles, and flipping it to condemn the racist, unequal society that they argue is the cause of these struggles. So that definitely is a little bit confusing, but hopefully that helps to clarify matters. So those are my thoughts on Lee's Building a Latino Civil Rights Movement. As always, your reflections are due Sunday by midnight. Again, please make it very clear in your reflections that you're reflecting on this specific reading, what you learned from this specific reading, and how it's relating to your own understandings. And if there are things that are confusing in the reading, right, then you can put that in your reflection as well. You know, oh, I didn't quite understand this part or that part. So again, just demonstrate that you are trying to wrestle with this material. And please reach out to me directly if you have any questions as well. And I will see you next week.